It combines capabilities that very few military aircraft in the world can match. It takes off like a helicopter, then flies like a plane. The V-22 Osprey. 40 years in development, billions of dollars spent, thousands of engineers, 2 countries, one near cancellation, and a legacy of crashes before it ever reached a battlefield. Today it serves the United States Marine Corps, Special Operations Command, and the U.S. Air Force as one of the most tactically versatile aircraft ever built. It can hover in confined urban environments, then cruise at 500 kilometers an hour to the next objective. No runway required. The aircraft has often been described as a major breakthrough in modern vertical flight capability, and they're right. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Decades before the Osprey entered service, Canada had already flown a remarkably similar VTOL concept, with only a fraction of the resources later invested into the Osprey program. It hovered, it transitioned, it flew, and the Americans were watching every move it made. 1965, Montreal, Canada. This is the story they forgot. To understand what Canada built, you first have to understand the problem nobody could solve. By the late 1950s, military planners on both sides of the Atlantic were facing a contradiction they couldn't engineer their way out of. Helicopters existed. They could hover, land anywhere, extract troops from impossible terrain, but they were slow, vulnerable, and limited in range. Put them anywhere near a contested airspace, and they became easy targets. Fixed-wing aircraft were the opposite. Fast, powerful, long-range, but they needed runways. Long, flat, prepared strips of concrete that made them predictable. In a war, predictable means targetable. What the military actually needed was both. An aircraft that could lift vertically from a ship deck or a jungle clearing, then accelerate to the speed and range of a conventional plane. No runway, no compromise. The concept had a name, VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was considered by most engineers to be somewhere between extremely difficult and fundamentally impossible. The physics of hovering and the physics of high-speed forward flight pull against each other in almost every direction. Building one aircraft that could master both meant solving an engineering contradiction that had defeated program after program throughout the 1950s. The Americans tried. The British tried. The Soviets tried. Many early VTOL projects struggled to balance stable hovering with efficient forward flight. Yet in Montreal, inside a company better known for building conventional jet aircraft, a group of Canadian engineers believed they had found an approach nobody else had seriously attempted. Not just tilting the propulsion system, tilting the entire wing. Canadair, Montreal, Quebec. By the early 1960s, the company had already built over 1,800 aircraft, licensed versions of American designs, patrol aircraft, jet trainers. Canadair knew how to manufacture. They knew how to engineer. But what their advanced projects team was now proposing was something different entirely. The idea was deceptively simple and brutally complex to execute. Most VTOL concepts of the era focused on rotating the engine nacelles, the housings that hold the engines, while leaving the wing fixed. The theory was that you could point your thrust upward for hover, then rotate it forward for flight. It was a logical approach. It was conceptually similar to the tilt-rotor approach later used by the V-22 Osprey. Canadair's engineers looked at that concept and identified a critical weakness. When using rotating nacelles, airflow management around the wing during hover becomes a major engineering challenge. This created difficult airflow and stability challenges during hover and transition. Maintaining stability between hover and forward flight became one of the hardest problems in VTOL engineering. Their solution was to eliminate that problem entirely. Rotate the whole wing. In hover mode, the entire wing assembly tilts upward, pointing the twin turboprop engines and their large propellers directly skyward. Clean, direct lift, no wasted airflow, no wing fighting the rotors. Then, as the aircraft accelerates, the wing tilts forward, smoothly, mechanically, continuously, until it locks into the horizontal position of conventional flight. In theory, the design offered several aerodynamic advantages during transition flight. In practice, making the concept reliable proved enormously difficult. Making the aircraft controllable in every phase of flight demanded extraordinary precision. The wing tilt mechanism had to be powerful enough to move under load, smooth enough not to destabilize the aircraft mid-transition, and reliable enough to function in combat conditions. The flight control system, this was the early 1960s, remember, years before fly-by-wire became standard, had to manage an aircraft that was constantly changing its aerodynamic character. The team pressed forward. Construction began on the first prototype, designation CL-84. On May 7, 1965, at Cartierville Airport in Montreal, the CL-84 lifted off the ground for the first time. It hovered, steadily, cleanly. Then it transitioned, wing tilting forward, nose pitching, propellers biting into forward air, and flew. Test pilots described the transition as surprisingly smooth, not violent, not chaotic, controlled. The aircraft seemed to want to fly. Early reports noted stability characteristics that exceeded expectations. Engineers who had spent years working through the calculations on paper were now watching those calculations move through the sky above Montreal. Word spread quickly through Canadian aviation circles. Then it spread further. The US military had been watching VTOL development across the Western world with serious institutional interest. The Cold War had sharpened the need considerably. Soviet air defense networks were expanding. Fixed NATO air bases in Europe were increasingly vulnerable to first strike scenarios. An aircraft that needed no runway was no longer a novelty concept. It was a potential strategic answer. So when reports began filtering south about a Canadian tilt-wing aircraft demonstrating stable, repeatable transitions over Montreal, the Americans sent people to look. What they found was an experimental aircraft already demonstrating unusually mature flight performance. The CL-84 was flying with confidence. It was demonstrating the full flight envelope: vertical takeoff, transition to forward flight, high-speed cruise, transition back to hover, vertical landing, in a sequence few comparable VTOL aircraft of the era had demonstrated so successfully. The US Navy and Marine Corps initiated a formal evaluation program. This was not a courtesy visit. The Americans brought the CL-84 into their own test environment. They put their own pilots in it. They evaluated it against their own operational requirements: ship deck operations, troop insertion, combat extraction, the exact missions that would define the V-22 Osprey's role decades later. The results were significant enough to sustain serious interest. Navy test pilots reported handling characteristics they hadn't expected. The tilt-wing transition, the moment every VTOL designer feared most, was manageable, controllable. The aircraft could operate from confined spaces. It could carry a useful payload. It could reach speeds far beyond those of conventional helicopters operating in similar roles. One evaluation report described the CL-84 as a genuinely capable VTOL design with real operational potential. For a Canadian aircraft company operating on a defense budget that bore no resemblance to the Pentagon's, building an aircraft that American military pilots were seriously evaluating for frontline roles, that was extraordinary. Canada had not just built a VTOL concept. They had built one serious enough to attract sustained American military evaluation. The program moved into an expanded phase. A second prototype flew, then a third. Canadian military observers joined the evaluations. There was serious discussion about production, about orders, about what a fleet of CL-84s might mean for North American tactical aviation. For a brief period in the late 1960s, the program appeared headed towards something historic, but the aircraft had a secret the test reports couldn't fully capture, and it was written into the physics of every flight it made. Tilt-wing aircraft faced their greatest challenges during transition flight. The transition, that window, somewhere between fully vertical and fully horizontal, where the aircraft is neither helicopter nor plane, where the aerodynamics are shifting, the control surfaces are changing authority, and the pilots are managing an aircraft that is fundamentally redefining itself mid-flight. In a helicopter, you know exactly what you have. In a conventional aircraft, the same. But in that transition band, you are flying something that does not fully belong to either world. And if something goes wrong in that window, an engine hiccup, a control input at the wrong moment, an unexpected gust, the aircraft has very little margin. Over the course of the program, all three CL-84 prototypes were eventually lost in separate accidents. Not 3 incidents, 3 aircraft gone. The crashes did not happen because the concept was wrong. They happened because the engineering margins were tight, the systems were complex, and the technology available in the 1960s was being asked to manage problems that would have challenged engineers decades later. Redundancy systems that modern designers take for granted simply did not exist in the same form. Flight computers that could catch a transition anomaly before a pilot could react, not yet available. Critically, all 3 losses occurred during testing. No production aircraft ever entered service. which means the crashes that grounded the program happened precisely when the program needed to be building confidence. Beyond the crashes, other pressures were accumulating. Cost. The CL-84 required sustained funding and long-term development support. Canadian defence budgets in the late 1960s and early 1970s were contracting, not expanding. A revolutionary VTOL aircraft requires sustained investment across years of development, the kind of long-term commitment that is difficult to protect when governments change and defence priorities shift. Doctrine was another problem. The Canadian military had no clear operational framework for what they would actually do with a fleet of tilt-wing aircraft. Helicopters filled existing roles. Conventional aircraft filled others. The CL-84 existed in a capability gap that military planners had not yet built the doctrine to fill. And then there was the American picture. American VTOL research was evolving rapidly. The American XC-142 tilt-wing program had already encountered major operational and funding difficulties during the 1960s. American defense investment was shifting toward other priorities, the war in Southeast Asia consuming enormous resources, attention, and political will. The window of American interest in Canadian VTOL technology, the window that had briefly made an order seem possible, was quietly closing. The CL-84 had proven it could fly. It had not yet proven it could survive the world it was flying in. By the mid-1970s, the program was effectively over. Not with a press conference, not with a formal announcement that made headlines. The CL-84 program simply ran out of road, funding withdrawn, military interest dissolved, the remaining prototype grounded and eventually retired. No production order ever came, from Canada or from the United States. The engineers who had spent the better part of a decade solving problems that the rest of the aviation world hadn't even properly defined yet, they moved on to other projects, other aircraft, other contracts. Canadair continued operating, building other things, serving other customers. The CL-84 became a chapter that quietly closed. 3 CL-84 prototypes were built during the program. Over time, all were involved in separate accidents, though one surviving airframe was ultimately preserved by the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa, not in a place of particular prominence, not with signage that explains what it represented or how far ahead of its time it genuinely was. It sits the way most forgotten technology sits, present, preserved, largely unread by the people walking past it. What makes the cancellation particularly difficult to process is not that the program failed. Programs fail. Technologies get cancelled. That is the normal friction of engineering at the frontier. What makes it difficult is the timing. By the mid-1970s, the CL-84 program had effectively come to an end. The United States began serious development of the V-22 Osprey in 1981. The Osprey reached wider operational maturity during the 2000s after decades of development, more than 3 decades. The V-22 Osprey is not a direct descendant of the CL-84. That distinction matters, and it deserves to be stated clearly. The Osprey's development followed its own lineage, its own contractors, its own decades of American defense investment. The engineers at Bell and Boeing did not build on Canadair's blueprints, but that is almost beside the point. What the CL-84 demonstrated, conclusively in front of American military evaluators, was that the concept worked, that a tilt-wing VTOL aircraft could be successfully built, flown and tested under demanding conditions, that the gap between helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft was not an unbridgeable one. Canada proved that in 1965, with resources dramatically smaller than those available to major American defense programs. The tragedy isn't that the CL-84 was cancelled. Difficult, expensive, dangerous programs get cancelled. That's not tragedy. That's the reality of pushing technology past what the present moment can sustain. The tragedy is the gap, the decades between a Canadian aircraft demonstrating vertical flight capability over Montreal and an American aircraft doing the same thing operationally over Iraq and Afghanistan. The engineers whose work was validated by history long after it stopped being funded, the concept that proved itself on a Canadian tarmac and then waited 30 years for the rest of the world to catch up. There is a single surviving CL-84 in Ottawa. It flew before most people who will ever walk past it were born. It solved problems that engineers in larger, wealthier programs were still arguing about years later. It impressed military evaluators, demonstrated real capability, and then quietly faded as budgets tightened and priorities changed. Aviation history remembers the Osprey. The CL-84 is what aviation history forgot. Canada built the future once, The world would spend decades catching up to the problem the CL-84 had already tried to solve.